Welcome to Section 6 of the Care1 online induction concerning positive behaviour support. This section contains information regarding a brief description of positive behaviour support, restrictive and prohibited practices, funder and Care1 positions on restrictive practices, and examples of restrictive practices. Positive behaviour support refers to the methodology applied by attendant care worker staff when care recipients display behaviours of concern. These have historically been called challenging behaviours, but this is an outdated term. The behaviours are not challenging for the person displaying them. They are only challenging for the people interpreting the behaviour. Behaviours of concern refer to behaviours that are of such an intensity, frequency, or duration that the physical safety of those nearby, including the care recipient, attendant care workers, or members of the community, are put at risk. It may include the damaging of property. It may also include behaviour that limits a person's ability to engage in everyday activities or community facilities. Imagine yourself grocery shopping. As you head to the counter, you notice another person is lining up in the 12 items or less register, but is carrying at least 40 grocery items. This greatly holds up the line and you are already running late for an appointment. There are a few possible ways a person may react to this scenario. Some people may just wait in line. Some people may just feel annoyed and use another register. Some people may comment to the checkout operator. Some people may comment to the shopper. Some people may complain to the manager. Some people may not be able to contain their frustration and start yelling, throwing items, and becoming aggressive. Behaviours of concern are where a person, when confronted with a scenario like this, may lash out or have a physical response either to themselves, the other shopper, or to property. It is important to note that most displays of behaviours of concern are communicative in nature. The person in the shopping example may be communicating that they are angry and frustrated, that they feel that they may be late for their appointment. They are not using very effective communication strategies, but they are definitely communicating. The problem is that with this type of communication, the listener may not get the message very well. It is not using generally accepted methods of communication. When working with people that may display behaviours of concern, part of the challenge is to work out what the person is communicating and trying to find acceptable and manageable methods for the person to communicate the same message, such as anger or frustration, without resorting to behaviours of concern. Restrictive practices and prohibited practices. When confronted with a person displaying behaviours of concern, you may need to act in a way that diffuses or manages the situation. Using the same shopping example, this could include slowly and calmly redirecting the person with a light touch and calming words, right up to physically restraining the person. A restrictive practice is where an attendant care worker is restricting the rights of a person with the primary purpose of protecting themselves and others. These should only be applied with a restrictive practice authorization as approved by a relevant panel or authority. In the shopping example, it may be guiding the person by gently directing them. This will only be as approved by the restrictive practices panel. A prohibited practice is where an intervention is applied that breaches the person's basic human rights or may even break the law. These interventions may include unauthorized restraints, such as physically grabbing the care recipient, unlawful restraints, such as handcuffs, or unauthorized clinical restraints, such as unapproved medication. A prohibited practice should never be applied under any circumstances. Funder and Care1 positions on restrictive practices. Funding bodies will have very clear policies and processes covering the application of restrictive practices. You need to be aware of and have knowledge of these. If you apply a restrictive practice outside of the guidelines, policies, and/or processes, you may be applying a prohibited practice. Care1 has a restrictive practices policy. iCare has a restrictive practices policy. The NDIS space has a set of rules covering restrictive practices. National Disability Insurance Scheme, Restrictive Practices and Behaviour Support Rules of 2018. These policies and rules are very clear. They set the parameters, guidelines, definitions, and scope for the application of restrictive practices. It is important to remember that restrictive practices are only to be applied under the guidance and direction of an approved restrictive practices process. This will only be as approved by the Restrictive Practices Panel. Examples of restrictive practices. These examples are as provided by the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission as part of their Regulated Restrictive Practices Guide. Seclusion, which means time out alone in a room or area where the person is unable to leave. For example, when Mary engages in behaviours that can harm others, the room or area she's in is evacuated and Mary is left alone and is unable to leave. Physical restraint, which means taking the person's hand and pulling them in a direction they do not want to go to. Environmental restraint, which means locking a door, cupboard, or fridge to prevent a person's access. For example, Mark is known to run out of the house and onto the road. The front and back door are locked to prevent Mark from running onto the road and ongoing traffic. Chemical restraint. For example, Bill has an intellectual disability. When Bill gets upset, he hits others and himself. Bill's GP prescribed a small dose of specific medication on a PRN as needed basis to help reduce the behavior of hitting. This is a chemical restraint. Mechanical restraints, which include splints, gloves, or a helmet to prevent a person from self-harming. For example, headbutting, pulling out their hair, hand biting, or skin picking. This brings us to the end of Section 6 of the Care1 online induction. Please continue on to answer the induction questions for this section.